Welcome to today's panel titled It Takes a Village, Bringing Industries Together Around Monarch Conservation. My name is Iris Caldwell. I'm from the University of Illinois, Chicago, and pleased to host our panel today about the Monarch Butterfly Candidate Conservation Agreement with Assurances. I'm joined today by a number of my colleagues and partners that have been involved in the development of the Monarch CCAA over the past several years, namely Dan Salas from Cardno, who was our technical consultant on the development of the agreement, and then 5 of our industry partners that have either enrolled in the CCAA or have been involved in the development and are in the process of enrolling. So you'll be hearing from each of them as we relate our stories and lessons from the first year of implementation. So to start off with just some background about the Monarch CCAA and how we got to the point of developing this conservation agreement. The conversation really began several years ago in a working group that we facilitate at the University of Illinois, Chicago, called the Rights of Way as Habitat Working Group. And through this working group, we've been engaging with energy companies and departments of transportation, railroads, and a number of non-government and government partners to find ways to promote habitat on energy and transportation lands. And increasingly what we're seeing is that these rights of way or other energy and transportation lands are being managed in a way that promotes what we consider early successional habitat. So low growing, scrubby, shrubby habitat or vegetation that is most compatible with the safety and operational needs of these energy and transportation lands. So there's a natural kind of alignment here in managing vegetation on rights of way and energy and transportation lands and providing much needed habitat for insect pollinators and a variety of other wildlife. But the question that we have to face when thinking about kind of dual purpose lands for operations and habitat is what impact would conserving an at-risk species on a working landscape like a right-of-way have on that organization maintaining some level of operational flexibility. And so that's exactly how we landed on the Candidate Conservation Agreement with Assurances as a regulatory tool that is one, voluntary, but two, provides an incentive for industry partners to commit to doing conservation for a species like the monarch butterfly in exchange for receiving incidental take coverage and regulatory assurances that in the event of an endangered species listing, they will have some level of coverage and flexibility to maintain their systems as they need to. And so over the course of several years, we developed what is the first nationwide candidate conservation agreement with assurances. This agreement was developed with a range of partners, over 40 industry partners across the US, from literally Maine to Arizona. And the goal of this agreement was to create and maintain more than 2 million acres of monarch habitat on energy and transportation lands. And there's a number of key benefits to this agreement. One is it provides immediate and long-term habitat for monarch butterflies. It provides regulatory certainty and operational flexibility to our industry partners, as I mentioned before. It really leverages a body of existing vegetation management practices, such as integrated vegetation management, that can, again, be used to promote the types of beneficial vegetation that can support monarchs and other pollinators. And the agreement as a whole has created this really energized public-private partnership that has been building momentum and capacity for monarch conservation over the past couple of years. So at this point, I'm going to turn things over to Dan, who will tell a little bit about how the agreement works.
All right, thanks, Iris. And thanks everybody for joining us today. So a little bit about how the CCAA works on the ground in case you're not familiar with it. As Iris has mentioned, it's an agreement. So it's an agreement that involves several parties, foremost being the partners that are enrolling land where they have operations and maintenance occurring. And within those enrolled lands, then selecting areas of what they call adopted acres. And adopted acres are where they're adopting conservation practices that then benefit monarchs. So if you look at that diagram we have on the screen, and a typical highway right-of-way, that might look something like this, where the enrolled lands might stretch for the full extent of lands maintained, essentially fence to fence, as it were. But then the adopted acres for many DOTs and highway agencies often occur on the back slope, the sort of areas beyond the drainage system where vegetation can be maintained more natural and more that early successional state, as Iris mentioned. And so by adopting a series of conservation measures in those lands, and this could be for particular segments of highways, or it could be for a full system, there's that commitment to do those measures, but then also to track them, to conduct monitoring, to verify that we actually have habitat elements for monarchs present in those areas, such as milkweed and nectar plants. And then on an annual basis, reporting that back along with the monitoring results to the program administrator and then ultimately Fish and Wildlife Service to document those commitments and those results. So the partners provide all that, they commit to doing that, and then in sort of exchange for that, the Fish and Wildlife Service, in cooperation with the program administrator, extend the incidental take coverage that's provided through the Section 10 permit that accompanies the CCAA. And so that Section 10 permit, if or when monarchs would be listed under the Endangered Species Act, that permit provides incidental take coverage for monarchs for operations and maintenance activities. In addition to the incidental take coverage, another important aspect or another important benefit that Iris touched on is that there's the assurances and that regulatory certainty. So you know what you are going to have to deal with from a regulatory standpoint, and the assurances that the agency won't change requirements on you at a later date, all in recognition of that upfront proactive conservation for monarchs. So if you go to the next slide, a little bit more on then how we got to this point. This effort was developed several years ago. It was started out of a facilitated brainstorming session we had at a Rights of Ways Habitat Working Group session in October of 2017, back when we could get actually in the room together and talk about these things. And the outcome of that initial brainstorm was that there was a lot of support, a lot of interest in pursuing an agreement like this. And so then over the course of the winter, there was securing funding for such an effort. And then really over the course of 2018, we worked with those 40 plus partners that Iris mentioned to scope what the agreement looks like, to draft it, to put all the details of it together so that by December of that year, so within a year or less of us starting this, getting that draft agreement submitted to Fish and Wildlife Service for their review. And then over the course of 2019, of course, Fish and Wildlife Service reviewed it, put it out for a 60-day public comment period, received those comments, and then in the latter half of that year, worked through final revisions and negotiations and then responses to public comments. The end result being in April of 2020, the permit was approved, the CCAA was finalized, and from there, UIC as the program administrator could begin enrollment. And so we received the first applications shortly following that, and over the course of 2020, had numerous partners engage in the first year of implementation. And the sum of all that effort was reported by UIC in March of 2021 in the very first annual report of the CCAA program. So in developing the CCAA, it was, as Iris mentioned, it's the first nationwide agreement. It was large. It was under a very fast timeline to prepare it. And naturally, with that timeline and that amount of parties involved, there was a lot of challenges along the way. And I won't have time to get into all the details now, but happy to talk about these as we get into the discussion and Q&A. But in short, some of the areas that were included or that were concerns or things we had to overcome in development included foremost biological concerns. How do we develop a nationwide agreement that has real biological lift that contributes to that net benefit standard that's required of these CCAA type agreements? And then to track that and document that, what types of metrics and targets are reasonable for all of these energy and transportation land managers to implement? We dealt with landowner concerns, thinking about how does the implementation of this agreement on lands, either abutting other landowners or on easements, comply with all those other agreements and laws and regulations. How does it affect landowners? How do they perceive it? And will they be cooperative in helping support these types of efforts along rights of ways? Then there was the administrative concerns. So just how do we complete an agreement of this size and scale, and then from a regulatory standpoint, complete things like a biological opinion at that scale for that many activities on such a wide area? And then once we've gone through all those approvals and we've worked through the sort of administrative concerns to get to that approval, when we implement the agreement, how do we do so in a way that's not burdensome to Fish and Wildlife Service, to UIC, or to the partners that are involved? And along with those administrative concerns then are the logistical concerns that it took to work collaboratively and remotely with 40 plus partners over the course of that year to elicit input, to get feedback, and then to consider the variations that we have in implementation and practices and habitats really across the lower 48 states. And so all of those, and then certainly more challenges, were things that we had to overcome in preparation of the agreement. So again, happy to talk about that more later, but for now, I'll pass it back over to you, Iris.
Great. Thanks, Dan. So as Dan said, in the first year, we received a number of applications, just over, I think in the first year it was just over 20, and now we're up to 28 applications that have been received, 16 of those from energy companies, 12 of them from transportation agencies, and those organizations are operating in the green shaded states, as you can see in the map on the right. And across those states, those 28 organizations have committed to managing just under 800,000 habitat acres. And if I overlay the Monarch migration map here, you can see that, again, the areas where we have organizations enrolling are some of the key areas along the Monarch migration path where conservation is needed. So we're seeing a lot of alignment there. Some gaps where we're still trying to fill, but really have been pleased with our initial year and the level of interest and support that we've received from our industry partners. So we're now going to move into some introductions from some of those industry partners themselves. We have gathered 5 different perspectives, a couple of state DOTs, a county road manager, and a couple utilities that are each going to share a bit about their programs. And then we'll have some time at the end for quite a bit of discussion to dive into some of those considerations even further. So with that, I will turn things over to our first presenter, Sam Glinsky from Texas Department of Transportation.
Thanks, Iris. And as you just heard from Iris, my name is Sam Glinsky. I'm with the Texas Department of Transportation. My job title is Vegetation Specialist. And I'm going to talk to you a little bit today about TxDOT's involvement in the CCAA, as well as just broader monarch conservation. So TxDOT has been involved directly with monarch conservation via the Monarch Highway program since 2016 when we signed into that. As a result of that, we created what we call monarch way stations at many of our safety rest areas across the state. And while these are small portions of habitat for monarchs, realistically, their purpose is more to spread the word to the general public. We've also been in talks with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service relating to the monarchs since the 2014 U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service Memorandum on Monarch Conservation. even prior to that, TxDOT has always actively supported our wildflowers, pollinators, and the monarch through some different conservation measures, which we'll talk about in just a minute. But these are targeted herbicide treatments, limited and timed mowing, non-mow areas, native seeding, and there are many more that I won't list out right now. We can go to the next slide, Iris. So TxDOT's enrollment in the Monarch CCAA and our adopted lands, we enrolled our entire system in the Monarch CCAA as we wanted coverage for incidental take on our entire system. That's 1.238 million acres. And we adopted land in 17 different districts. The way we chose these is mainly following the central flyway of the Monarch, with some of the districts that we have far north, far east, and far west not being included for various reasons, either being outside the central flyway, just travel time to get there, certain things like that. But one important thing to highlight is that while we adopted about 446,000 acres, our conservation measures are occurring across TxDOT's entire system. Just because we chose not to adopt land in the district doesn't mean we're not conducting our conservation measures. And the reason why we'll talk about on the next slide in just a minute. All right, we can go next, Iris. So for our conservation measures, they predate the Monarch CCAA. And this is why I was talking about our conservation measures being implemented across our whole system, not just the adopted acreage that we pledged in the CCAA. Things like wildflower seeding, delayed and timed mowing cycles, non-mow areas, targeted herbicide treatments, these have all been implemented for decades. In some cases, we've been delaying our mowing until the wildflowers have set seed since the 1930s. So it's been quite a while. But we have the goal of promoting wildflowers and supporting our pollinators, and more recently, supporting the monarch. So just based on our existing programs that we already had, the choice to join the Monarch CCAA was very easy, because we're helping to promote these programs and recognize these programs, but also directly showing that we are contributing to the health of the monarch population. And that's all I've got for now. Thanks, Iris.
Great. Thank you so much, Sam. And I'll turn it next to Mel.
Thanks, Iris. Mel Odens here, the Public Works Director for Kandiyohi County in the center of Minnesota. As you can kind of see on the screen, our county is it's a local government, and our number one industry is an ag county, but our number two is really the tourism part, because we have a lot of lakes, trails, and parks. And then the third part of our industry is professional. So shortly after the Monarch process or option for doing an agreement became reality in the summer of 2020, we began talks about it. I went to the county board and did some pros and cons of if we did the project, and maybe one of the biggest things that we found out was we started out internally. We did kind of an inside out approach, where I went to my public works staff that actually do the work, and then I went to the county board, and then I went to the public. They asked me to go to the public, and so I did, and we had an outpouring of public support. And I think because our second industry is kind of a tourism industry, and so the county board asked us to make application, and we were the first county in the nation to enroll in the program. And so who are we as a county? We have 650 miles of bituminous and aggregate roads. We did the 5% of our total acres, which amounts to right at 200 acres. We divided the county up into 3 monitoring areas. And so why would we consider joining the program? Well, as what we were hearing, not only from, probably was strongly reinforced by the public, which maybe was a surprise for me because we build roads, but they wanted us to be a leader in the environmental stewardship part, because we have a local TV station that's really strong in the pollinators. And so when we were doing our net impact, we were figuring that it was going to be cost neutral, and in some cases probably some of the roads we need to do would actually be money savings if we were to have to do environmental studies or delay construction. So the elected officials were all about it, and maybe one of the main key is that it was unanimously approved because of the positive public response. So some of the reasons that we, once again, that we did it is we took a proactive approach to a problem that we see that's being developed nationally. We always are driving to get better and improve our practices, and we wanted that regulatory certainty with future work, and so we wanted to, strive to always maintain good relations with our regulatory agencies. So we feel good about the program here as a local government, and we feel good about it. So that's all I have. Thank you.
Thank you, Mel. Next, I'll turn over to Eric.
Yeah, thanks, Iris, and hello, everybody. Again, my name is Eric Johnson. I'm a biologist for Evergy. Evergy is an investor-owned electric utility, and our service territory is in eastern Kansas and western Missouri. We are what's considered a vertically integrated company, so we produce power at our generation sites. We transmit that power down the high voltage transmission lines to substations, and then we distribute that power to customers. So that kind of gives us a large scope of the landscape that we operate in. So to kind of give you an idea, we operate about 52,000 miles of distribution line, about almost 14,000 miles of transmission line. So to kind of put that in context, what that means from an acreage perspective is about 120,000 acres that we have some level of management authority over. When it comes to right-of-way, those are typically easements where we manage vegetation, but we don't have full management over. But then we do also own about 43,000 acres of property, primarily around our generation sites, as well as substation and our operations. And so with that being said, one of the biggest reasons we're interested in the Monarch CCAA is really the history of our company's stewardship, primarily grasslands and habitat conservation in Kansas. Kansas has what's known as the Flint Hills. It's the largest remaining tract of tallgrass prairie in North America. It's both, ecologically sensitive as well as cultural. Lots of cattle ranching, large open areas, and so over the years we've been pretty important stewards of that, and really we didn't want to actually be penalized for our past good deeds. So that was one of the biggest drivers early on in our interest. And so when it come down to what it took to be a part of the Monarch CCA, of those roughly 160,000 acres of property, or both easements or company-owned property, we've committed to preserving or enhancing about 20,000. So that's adopted acres, that's Monarch habitat. And when we break that down further, it really comes into about 10,000 acres of that is our company-owned land. So one example is Jeffrey Energy Center. It's a large coal-fired power plant that we have about 5,000 acres of grassland around. The other 50%, or roughly 10,000 acres, kind of falls into our easements. So those are largely transmission line easements that we have vegetation management authority over, but that's really what it comes down to. We have to work with a lot of private landowners. And so the bottom picture on the left kind of just gives you an idea of the scope of what we've enrolled into the CCAA. Next slide. Kind of the highlights, I think, as far as our first year implementing the Monarch CCA is like Dan mentioned earlier, it's really designed in a way that you didn't really have to hire a lot of new staff or pay a lot of consultants to do the work. So we've used existing staff throughout our territory. So I'm technically the only biologist for the company, but we do have trained biologists that work in other areas, and so I've benefited from their ability to go out and do some of the effectiveness monitoring for me. I've also worked with a lot of our other groups to repurpose data that they've already collected as far as number of acres mowed, number of acres herbicide application. And so when it came down to it, it really wasn't a big change for our management as far as vegetation on our rights of ways. But I will say it will move the needle. And so every new interest when it comes to early successional habitat and doing something that's compatible, will continue to move the needle as we move forward along our right-of-ways. I think another important component was that really the Monarch listing decision was late last year, and the potential lawsuits coming up is really a non-issue for us. We know we've kind of set our course as far as regulatory and conservation for the next several years. So that's a big seller for our company, some regulatory certainty moving forward. Moving forward, I think some of our biggest potential as far as habitat creation really revolves around our retired coal plants. And so a lot of these have several thousand acres surrounding it that are no longer going to be used for landfills. And so we're restoring those areas once we close out a landfill or take down a structure, as well as our solar farms that we're becoming more involved in, both at the community level and the industrial level, that a lot of that early successional pollinator or monarch habitat is really consistent with what we need to have under those panels if it makes sense for that site. So yeah, looking forward to other questions moving forward.
Great. Thanks, Eric. Next, I'll turn things over to Bill.
Thanks, Iris. Hi, my name is Bill Conn. I work for Vermont Electric Power Company up here in the Northeast in Vermont. I'm a certified utility arborist for Vermont Electric Power Company. My job is to maintain the right-of-way. We have about 726 miles of transmission line that cross the whole state of Vermont. And we manage about 12,000 acres of right-of-way on a 4-year cycle. So we actively manage a quarter of that every year. In addition, we have other land holdings that are like laydown yards, environmental mitigation sites, or Velco controlled lands that are within our easement. And we have lease agreements with state agencies and other entities within the state, and some are fee owned. So basically my job is to make sure there's no vegetation caused outages, make sure we're compliant with the NERC FACT 003-4, ensure compliance with all our state public service board rules, and ensure compliance with herbicide permitting. Next slide. The reason we saw the CCAA as a good thing to get into is it fit into our program that we've been doing for the last 3 decades or more here at Velco. It's an integrated management program that we run here. We're trying to manage the rights of ways in a herbaceous state with very little shrubby vegetation. And we do that by using applied herbicide on sites, which is good for us because we've already managed for the monarch butterfly and milkweed in the right-of-way. That has been shown, at least here in Vermont, that those are good plants to have to keep other woody stem vegetation out. And it fit well into our program. With what we're already doing, it wasn't a lot of extra work for us. And we walk our whole system annually. So for us to check sites yearly or as needed, it was no extra work for any of our foresters that work for us. Next slide. So why IVM? Like I said, the reasons: it promotes sustainable plant communities, and we've been doing it for a long time, working with other organizations already. So it was a win-win for us, and we get to showcase the work that we do in the right-of-way already to preserve different wildlife habitats throughout the state, and it helps showcase the right-of-way stewardship designation that we have. We don't have a lot of opportunities within the vegetation department to showcase our work. We're always in the public's eye for spraying herbicide, mowing brush. When we do mow our brush and vegetation, we try not to do that April to September to make sure that the wildflowers can go to seed and there's ample pollinator habitat throughout our system. So that's it for me, and I'll take questions later. Thank you.
Great. Thanks so much, Bill. And lastly, I'll turn it to Kris from Arizona Department of Transportation.
All right. Thanks, Iris. I'm Kris Gade. I'm part of environmental planning at ADOT. I work mostly on biological resources and coordination across the various groups working on vegetation management within the agency. So I'll start with a little bit about ADOT. ADOT operates and manages about 7,000 miles of roads, comprising around 200,000 acres, including the highway rights-of-way, other parcels, and the Grand Canyon Airport. Arizona has a high percentage of federally owned lands, so we consult with many other agencies and land managers on our approaches to maintenance and environmental compliance. Monarch butterflies are on our radar because they can be found seasonally across the state, and some even overwinter in our lower desert areas. ADOT's been using native seed mixes following all our construction projects for around 30 years. So we definitely have nectar resources in our rights-of-way in many areas. But also, like other Western states, milkweed is very patchy in the landscape in Arizona. And so we're still working on identifying where it is already occurring in the lands we manage. So we're interested in the CCAA because it's going to help us document our conservation efforts and streamline Endangered Species Act compliance for both construction and maintenance activities. It will also help us with having consistent monarch conservation measures for our roads that are on easements from different landowners and managers. Next. So many people think of the desert or the Grand Canyon in association with Arizona. And those are pretty good examples because they kind of give an idea of the large range in elevation throughout the state. And that leads to having a lot of different biotic communities. So this map shows the ADOT district, and the colors represent different biozones that we use when we're working on scheduling vegetation management activities. So next. And these represent each of the different biotic communities. So in the south and west of the state, we have desert and grassland communities, as well as higher elevation sky islands in the southeast in the orange. The north and east have a mix of higher elevation desert and forested areas. So as a result, Arizona has high biodiversity, and we actually have around 29 species of milkweed across the state. And as I mentioned, we also have a large amount of land that's managed by the Bureau of Land Management. We have 5 national forests and several wildlife refuges and military bases, as well as a significant amount of tribal land. Next. So we're currently working on our application to the CCAA. And the map on this slide shows the Western Monarch Milkweed Mapper, which is reports of observations of milkweeds and monarchs across the state. You can see we do have reports of milkweed quite widespread, although the monarchs are mostly reported more in the population centers. So to support our application, we're working on a model with the Arizona Game and Fish Department of milkweed suitability. And that'll help us better define where habitat is and if there might be areas that would not be monarch habitat. We also plan to use the model to help us prioritize areas for focused conservation actions. So as mentioned by Sam for TxDOT, reducing and scheduling mowing are likely to be the conservation actions that are most widely applied within our rights-of-way. And that brings challenges in things like establishing those schedules, because the times when monarchs are present in different parts of Arizona can really vary year to year depending on temperatures and timing of rainfall. So we're working out how to set specific dates that are when mowing should start or end, that kind of thing. We're also working out how to integrate reduced mowing while also meeting our safety needs, like maintaining sight distances and reducing fire starts. We're looking at how to protect areas that are designated for conservation within the rights-of-way, and then also training staff on planning maintenance activities with monarchs in mind and identifying milkweeds and other plants. Back to you, Iris.
Great. Thank you, Kris. And thanks again to all of our presenters for those quick introductions. This sets us up, I think, for a good discussion on the CCAA, the wide variety of different types of partners that have been involved in the development of the Monarch CCAA, as well as just thinking broadly about monarch conservation on energy and transportation landscapes. And so from here, we'll move into the discussion around the outcomes from the first year of the CCAA, as well as other implementation considerations. So stay tuned.